Welcome to today's webinar, a continuation of the series on global chaos and what's contributing to it. Today, we're going to be looking at the driver of neoliberalism, featuring an interview and discussion with Robert McGarvey, who was the author of the recent article this past Sunday, and has a lot to say about why Trump won. So I'm going to welcome you, Robert, to today's webinar to discuss your recent writing about progressive politics, which have contributed to the global chaos, or the extent to which they have. And the election, of course, is a recent example, with the election of Donald Trump in the US coming to many as a disappointment and to many others as a shock. So, but before we begin, what have you been up to lately?
Well, thanks, Perry. It's great to be here. Lately, what I've been doing lately. Well, I'm director of the Rethinking Capital Foundation in London, and we've been examining what we call the normative reset. This is a whole series of reforms and rethinking around governance, economics, politics, accounting, very importantly, accounting, based upon this idea that well, two things really. One, that the economy is experiencing a paradigm shift, similar in scale to the Industrial Revolution and the commercial revolution that preceded it. So the engine of growth is transforming, and the capitalist system is still trying to catch up. And secondly, this whole idea that neoliberalism as a governing creed, an orthodoxy that governs all kinds of decisions and behaviors and norms and values in the system, is being supplanted by something. And so we would like to understand, A, what the flaws are in neoliberalism, presuming there are flaws, and what might come subsequently. So there's an effort to examine that on the macro level that really brought us. In fact, it brought us to this idea of one of the issues around neoliberalism, and Margaret Thatcher was very keen on this, is neoliberals believe that society doesn't exist, that we're all individuals with no moral responsibility towards one another. And it was a very energized kind of belief system at the time. But what it did is it kind of diminished society and demonized it. And so we think that that is one of the causes of the rise of critical theory, and in its sort of popular manifestation, something that people call woke. And so this is really the topic of the conversation today, but we think it originated from serious ethical and metaphysical flaws in neoliberal philosophy that have changed people's opinion about society and diminished its importance to the point where it's having damaging effects across the board.
Well, with many ideologies, I mean, this would be the first that an ideology ends up being pushed to an extreme. And we've seen that. I think your recent article for the network included reference to the US election. Clearly, Trump's public behavior was overlooked by better than 50% of the voters. I think it was something in the order of 76 million, but he won by only 2%, but he won. Most pundits cite voter concern with the cost of living. You've cited other factors. What do you believe were the most significant factors that led to Donald Trump's reelection?
Well, I think there's no doubt that, like every incumbent, that the Biden-Harris team suffered from the impact of the cost of living inflation. I think that played, in our view, that was a trigger. It wasn't the underlying cause. The underlying cause, we believe, was the direction of society. I think the Obama, Biden, Harris progressive definition of whatever progressivism means to them didn't resonate with the public, and they overlooked personality flaws and maybe some wild and crazy policy options that Trump had at his disposal, and but that was more attractive than the alternative. So I think it had a major impact at the end of the day. It was an emotional response. I think there was a sense that so much of the woke narrative blames, either explicitly or implicitly, the core American values for difficulties that are inherent in American society. And I think Americans love their country, and it's just about as simple as that.
Well, you described in the article that the victory appeared to be a referendum, or could be looked at as a referendum on 20th century progressive values, were fundamental to the Democratic position. Could you elaborate on which aspects of this progressive agenda you think the electorate most strongly rejected?
Well, I think it's the negativity. I think when you look at woke, if we go beyond woke and get to more serious analytics, woke is an offshoot of critical theory. Now, critical theory has deep roots. It comes from the French. You can trace it all the way back to the Enlightenment and the writings of Rousseau. And so when, well, during the Enlightenment, when the medieval world was being re-examined and reinterpreted, there was an interesting debate. It was called the state of nature debate. And there were three major philosophers that took part in that debate. One was Rousseau himself, but then there was John Locke and who's the conservative voice? That's Thomas Hobbes.
Yeah.
And Hobbes basically made the case that the natural state of humanity was horrendous. It was a world of brutality, where life was nasty, brutish, and short. And so what he was trying to get at is that even rational people would now concede their perilous liberty in the natural state in order to have security in what he called the Leviathan in society. Locke came along and said, well, yeah, okay, let's assume that the natural state is undesirable, but let's use reason and apply reason to the laws of nature so we can create unique laws of human nature. He's the father of liberalism. Basically, he believed in property rights and the division of powers, very much in the American tradition. Rousseau, on the other hand, thought that the natural state of humanity, in the absence of restraint, was a perfect liberty. Now, that's all very well. I mean, he famously said that, man's born free, and everywhere he is in chains. But the implication of that is that government and its agents must be the source of oppression that is preventing the natural liberty of society. And you can see this in the French Revolution. Famously, Robespierre was a famous romantic and a true believer in Rousseau. And what happens if you believe that liberty is simply the absence of restraint, when you break the system like the revolutionary French did, and liberty doesn't break out as you had planned, then you look for scapegoats. And of course, the establishment, the aristocracy, and the romantic sort of option is, well, let's just kill them. And
Right.
you can see that kind of view was prevalent in the French Revolution. It obviously infused Marxism with its hatred of the establishment, and you know, if you look at the Russian Revolution, the crackdown on the bourgeoisie was generated by very similar forces. Critical theory is rampant today in our universities, and it is probably the dominant belief system, because your philosophy of history, if you believe critical theory, is that society and history is just a catalog of oppression. If you're a Lockean, on the other hand, you say, okay, we started in this bad place, but we have been using rights, and we've been using logic and reason, and we are emancipating over a long period of history. So generally, if you're Lockean in your historical view, you will believe that society is getting better, but also that society is a social good, whereas romantics, critical theory, woke, believe that society is essentially evil, oppressive, and must be.
So the allure of this romantic perspective, which we'll call woke for the moment, was pretty well the bastion, or is viewed to be the bastion, of the Democratic Party, and yet the minority groups in the U.S., whether it was Latinos or blacks, certainly Middle America, was turning away from figures like Harris or the Democratic Party due to their association with woke feminist progressivism.
Yeah.
Why? Can you give us some examples of policies or samples or stances that have alienated the voter? What is it that was being professed at the national election level that really turned these people away?
Well, it would seem, you know, immigrants, if they come to the United States recently, are generally escaping real tyranny, not this invented fake nonsense that academics are trying to convince us of. And so I think that played a big part, is that they just didn't believe that America was evil, and the source of their inequality. You know, these are people who had real experience with real evil, and by and large, I think that played a big part in it. I also think these are very conservative, very paternalistic societies, and so, as a general rule, they would favor a strong male president rather than a young progressive female. And I think that, you know, we saw black men shift from Democrats. We saw Hispanics, by and large, Muslims across the board. And so I think it's a complicated set of facts, but I think the trend was clear that some combination of sexism, you know, paternalistic kind of resonance, there was a lot of factors there. But again, I think we come right back down to who do I trust to govern? And I trust somebody who believes in America, because, you know, if I'm an American, then I love my country. I think it's very simple, actually.
That's a fascinating perspective about what the United States is and what democracy is supposed to be. It's worth taking a look at something you made a comment on earlier, and that was describing wokeism as having moved from academic circles into mainstream institutions and becoming a way of life. The media picked up on it, the institution picked up on it, the nonprofits, the grant monies. Why do you believe it gained such traction, particularly here in Canada? And what impact can be expected on public institutions like media, education, and government as we go forward? If this is now being challenged, where are we going?
Well, I think if you look at what incubated this critical theory, it started in gender studies, programs in universities, indigenous studies programs, you know, the cult of the underdog. Each one of these issue areas became captivated by critical theory, and for the longest time, starting in the 60s and 70s, they were boiling away inside universities. But now they've educated a generation of feminists, a generation of activists, and these activists are now institutional authority. They have taken over the governance regimes of all the universities. I mean, the universities are particularly prone to this. And so when you look at the public school system, it's adopted a woke view of history and is now changing the curriculum of even elementary schools to reflect all this. It's in advertising. If you look at advertising in media, you would not, I mean, Caucasians have disappeared from the advertising space in Canadian media. You wouldn't know, looking at advertising, that there are any Caucasian people in Canada. All of these factors have become real.
Well, that Black Lives Matter just months ago seemed to almost immediately be translated into a shift in advertising.
Yeah, it kind of woke masticized at that point. And I think, you know, that's another factor. People don't appreciate how when romantic perspective becomes the institutional authority. This is what happened in the French Revolution when Robespierre became first a member of the Committee of Public Safety and then the head of it. That he did real institutional damage. I mean, not institutional damage. He did real personal vendettas, and then you can see the same in Russia in 1917 when the communists, when the Bolsheviks took over, and they're holding institutional power, and they're really strongly influenced by romantic kind of philosophy. Then they instituted the reign of terror, and I think you can see it. It's not as extreme in the United States or in Canada, but it is ubiquitous.
Is it fair or superficial to say that what we've done is, instead of the pursuit of reason, we've been in the pursuit of feelings, or the acknowledgement that feelings trump reason?
Well, I think, you know, Bertrand Russell famously described the difference between romantics and liberals as faith on the one hand and science on the other. Science is very humble, it's very rational, but faith is driven by emotions, and it's you can see the transition from rational discourse to what you call feelings, which is really the articulation of what they call sensibilité. So the French describe it as this: you're overwhelmed. You must realize your emotional fullness, and it's got to be extreme. And so that's a major distinction between Lockean liberal approaches and romantic approaches. And so we in the English-speaking world have been governed ever since the Enlightenment by a Lockean view of history.
Mm-hmm.
But because we have, I mean, on the continent, they've seen romantic explosions of various times, including the French and certainly the Russians and Germany in the Nazi period, that were quite strongly oriented that way. But the English-speaking world has been isolated from it. We're not inoculated against the disease. That's the problem. There has been no intellectual pushback against this, and no real common sense deterrent to it. So it has captured the institutional high ground. It has become the establishment, and so but the public, the tide has turned with the public, which I think is interesting.
I don't know whether this is relevant. It may take us off track, but as you were speaking, I got to thinking about the emergence of learning language models, artificial intelligence, people being critical that it isn't sentient, it doesn't have reason, it doesn't have feelings. And my view was, thank God it doesn't have feelings, that maybe it is the engine of reason being returned. You want to comment? Is it any sidebar comments you want to make about the emergence of AI or
Well, I think
this whole issue?
It's a remarkable advance in cognition. What's missing? It's very right brain, if you want to simplify it. What's missing from AI is left brain, empathy, the whole relational.
Okay, it's the other way around. It's the right brain that's emotional. It's the left brain that learning logic and linear.
Okay, well, whatever. But that's what's missing from the AI, and that's why it needs kind of guardrails to be particularly acceptable. But I think is this an antidote to the problems we face? Could be.
It's amazing that it's so often technology emerges to fill a gap, and maybe that is exactly why it's arrived and has become so popular. But I'm going to shift gears here. You mentioned alliances between Western activists and groups in the Middle East, such as those between climate and pro-Palestinian activists. In your view, what's driving these alliances? I mean, they've emerged, whether it was the and what risks or misunderstanding might they bring?
Well, I think it's you see, there's if you take a romantic view of history, you will reassign virtue. Virtue resides with the oppressed. You see, a Lockean view assigns virtue to the establishment. The establishment is this slow machine that is slowly advancing rights and pursuing social improvement. But a Lockean sees the world much differently than a romantic. A romantic sees oppression and power, and so it assigns virtue to the oppressed. And so this is just an assignment of virtue to anyone who they perceive to be oppressed. They're all on the same mission to overturn the oppressive authority that's preventing them from realizing their full liberty.
And you just articulated what CBC has become, which is 24 hours of, if you're not a victim, you ought to appreciate that you have been oppressed. We must empower the state to help you.
The CBC has programmed to highlight the virtue of the underdog, and which is, I'm certainly not opposed to discussing that, but what the CBC also implies is that the reason that people are underdogs is because the traditional values in traditional society is responsible for their diminished positions in society. And so, that's where I think the irony of queers or Hamas is almost beyond belief. And but when you look at it through this lens of, well, we're commonly oppressed, we have the same goal, which is the destruction of the oppressive superstructure that is controlling us, then you can see where the commonality might arise. I think it's absurd, but then so much of this is absurd.
Well, is the only way out of this? I mean, I comment on the election being a shock to many. implying that this came out of the blue. Clearly, enough is enough. We've gone way too far. The excesses have now been recognized. Does it take? I mean, it isn't reason. It's almost saying we need a sledgehammer to turn this around. Where's the leadership? It says,
Well,
okay, we have alternatives. It's all well and good, and I see the Democratic Party doing this right now. It's so typical, getting into the blame game
yeah.
within their own party, as opposed to, look, we've got to come up with a different vision. We didn't win an election. Let's look forward. Let's look ahead. Let's figure out where we need to go. Where are we headed, as opposed to where are we not going? I mean, Kamala did say we're not going back. She wasn't particularly clear on where we were
Well,
going.
and I think, you know, if you're asking me, I would describe myself as a 20th century liberal. I believe in Lockean progress. So that's all about society becoming progressively more inclusive, progressively
Civil.
more equal. So
Right.
but that's not what woke
Right.
uses that language, but employs it to eliminate what it perceives to be the oppressor class inside institutional authority. So diversity has come to mean anything but white males or traditional feminists. Equity has become a license to treat people inequitably, and you know, I think the misuse of language is, and this is another very common aspect or quality of romanticism. Their method of changing the system is to change the language, to change the meaning of words. Like hate used to mean something very particular. It was a vicious, irrational desire to hurt. But now it's if you don't believe what we believe, you're a hater. You see, and so they've taken diversity, equity, and inclusion and reversed the meanings of those words to help them advance their agenda of breaking the system so that it may become, in their mind, you know, a more liberal order.
Okay, I had a discussion this week, and it concerned me, of someone that has the insight that enough is enough, and used the word, we need to dismantle, we need to destroy, we need to break down. And I thought that is just going to take us backwards and create a bipolar situation of those protecting the status quo from those that want to destroy it, as opposed to the more moderate liberal leader that says, look, we've got to work together to go forward. And I can recall in my own experience of deinstitutionalization, there were those that wanted to blow up the institution, which would have left the inmates in the street, as opposed to those that took the initiative to be what I would call more progressive, of prepare the people, prepare the community, and build the infrastructure beforehand, so that we can have a reasonable, quote, the word of the day is transition.
Yeah.
So are we going to see the transition that's in front of us away from wokeism as a moderate transition, or are we simply going to have another sledgehammer come at us, setting bipolar situation, take us backwards again?
That's a very relevant question, because the sledgehammer is coming out in the United States, and we'll see how that works. That Rethinking Capital Foundation, we want to bring people back to what we think is a historically correct view of history. The Western history is very dynamic. It has been emancipative, starting from Nadir in the 11th or 12th century. There has been a steady progress towards a sharing in the exercise of sovereignty across racial, gender, you know, all kinds of different boundaries have been included in the governing orthodoxy. So understanding our history, it has been very coercive, it's been very warlike, but underlying it is this evolution in the ethical foundation of Western society, and that must be protected. If you blow things up, that's what you destroy.
Right.
And so it's very important.
That was my concern, is that once you get into using violence, either way, in order to achieve your objectives, you have thrown away the very principles and foundations of what democracy is supposed to be built on, are using the election and the voice of the people in order to bring about a transition. So this leads me, though, to the next question, and the wrap-up question before I ask the audience for their input. What do you believe Canada's Liberal Party and progressive movements elsewhere can learn from this election? I mean, Canada is typically looked at as nicer, more moderate. We have a situation in Canada which is likely to confront the woke agenda and take a lesson from what may well have from the U.S. Are there specific adjustments that we should consider to avoid a similar backlash?
Well, I think that you can see that the polls moving. The liberal agenda is under enormous pressure, and I think that's part of the same phenomena. Yes, it has to do with the cost of living. That is a trigger event.
Right.
But I think the public is reacting against the Trudeau government's woke agenda, if I can call it that. Their obsession with climate, their obsession with identity politics, almost their entire agenda around immigration. All of these policies have diverted their attention from the core in Canada, who is now suffering. Mm-hmm. And if you're a wage earner and you're living on the margin, the cost of living is your biggest concern. And you're blaming the Liberal government for that problem. And so I think there's an inflation aspect to this change in public sentiment, but also I think, just like in the United States, Canadians love their country, and they don't buy this idea that it's white Canadians are somehow responsible for the ills of the entire world. I think quite the opposite. They feel quite proud of their country, and they're starting to react against the implied negativity that the Liberal Party has been kind of indulging in over the last 10 years.
Well, I always felt that July 1st should be an important day in Canada, and it seems to have lost its appeal. I'm going to call on a couple of those who have indicated on the chat that they've got something to offer, a question of you, Robert. Peter, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thanks, Robert. Very interesting presentation. I'm just wondering, I really appreciate you. I mean, I know about critical theory. I've certainly heard about this before, but I never traced it back to the sort of the French, philosophers and so forth. So has this concept of woke, may it be a new name, but has it been around for a long time?
Oh, yeah.
Or is this just something that has emerged in America as a junction of several different streams?
Well, you see, it's prevalent in the West because we have a dynamic civilization. It doesn't show up in societies where everything is fixed and stays the same.
Yeah.
So once you have this idea that the future can and should be better than the present, then you create what we call normative gaps, because our perception of what should be and when we compare it with what is, there's always this contradiction. And so a Lockean liberal will say, well, let's get down and work out the details and see if we can make it better. A romantic says quite the opposite, you know. And this phenomena is prevalent in Western civilization because of the inherent dynamism of our culture. It's quite unique. This doesn't exist globally. It's what makes the West so special. But it also leads to this apparent contradiction.
Just as I may, as a follow-on question, do you feel that this trend at all is challenging the Westphalian model?
I think, well,
Mhm.
it's seen.
Explain what that might. Wait. Not too many people will know what that model is. So let's give them that background first.
The creation of the nation state as a result of the Treaty of Westphalia several centuries ago.
Yeah.
Which we ended up having these rights to a nation, and our international relations have evolved since.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's well, we see at various stages that the Soviets, for instance, didn't believe in nationalism for the same reasons we're discussing. That internationalism became one of their early creeds, and I think critical theory is if you look at who the enemy is, they would say it's the state, and they would more importantly say it's the nation state. So that's the agency of oppression. Let's get rid of it. And the Soviets wanted to go international. You see, there's lots of forces that would like to undermine the very foundations of rights, because they see them as an agency of oppression.
What's fascinating is the fact that the U.S., with 51 states, has so much diversity in terms of the demography and the nations within nations, that it would be very hard to see that nation coming apart. That diversity is, in fact, probably one of its strengths, as a recognition of the extremes that need to be tolerated within a nation.
Yeah, and you can see,
I would argue India is somewhat similar.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Canada's risk maybe that it's only got 13 jurisdictions.
Democracy it emerges from the ground up in the United States.
Right.
It's in the weave of the cloth.
It's the DNA.
Yeah.
Okay, Randall, you talking cults? You walked right into this. Go ahead. What's your perspective?
Yeah. Well, and there's a whole other way of looking at this. That is that it's nothing to do with ideologies at all, but an opportunistic, an opportunity for narcissists to recruit followers and gain power. It may have to do with like what happens in cults, where they go out and recruit dispossessed, disenfranchised, discouraged people and make promises that they will be winners and successful and so on. And it's possible that the leaders of the woke movement, many of them are doing that quite consciously, and others are along for the ride, seeing that their prospects are rising within that movement. And the more they buy into the ideology, the more the success they see within that community.
Well, there's certainly a lot of that in cult-like behavior in universities. They have safe rooms for students, because if for instance, if a Jordan Peterson is coming to discuss on campus, they're so conscious that an opinion contrary to what they have been feeding their cult would create cognitive dissonance. And so I think you're right. I think there's strong ideological antecedents to the woke movement, but the people they're collecting around, and the students that are sort of drinking deeply from this, there's a cult-like behavioral characteristic to it. I think you're absolutely right.
We saw that, we featured Frances Widdowson when she was under attack, wanting to speak at Lethbridge about free expression. And she was chastised by the students who wanted free expression, and that's exactly what it was she wanted to champion. Go ahead.
Well, there's more to it because it's not just that. I mean, one could say the same about the Trump followers, the MAGA followers, that they too feel cheated and dispossessed and disenfranchised and have followed a cult leader of their own. And so I think there's a lot of people out in our modern world of complexity that feel cheated. They didn't get what they were promised.
Yeah, look, that's not different. What concerns, I think, all of us is not that there's difference of opinion on whether or not they have or have not, but whether they use violence in order to achieve their objectives. That's right. I love the debate that is so rich about democracy. I think that's difficult sometimes for immigrants to appreciate, that democracy is rough and tumble. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it's emotional, it's highly intellectual, it's complex, but it works.
Yeah, if the debates were actually rational, and we could pick the one that actually puts forward the best policies, that would be ideal.
Look, this is not a world. Let's go back to the French Revolution. All human beings are not necessarily voting on rationality. They're voting on their feelings too, which is what led to this woke.
Yeah, and in this world, there's a lot of cognitive fatigue. People shutting down because they can't concentrate anymore. They've got information overload. There's all this.
Well, I think you've just articulated what we're going to likely see in Canada. Is
yeah.
Okay. Yogi, it's your turn.
Thank you. So, Robert, thank you for that analysis on history and how this whole woke ideology got going and how its negative impacts on our society. You know, I don't think a lot of voters in the US election were driven by a sophisticated analysis like you've delivered to us. I'm fascinated that Black people and Latino people who have been championed by some of these DEI policies actually voted a different way. So I tend to think that their concerns around inflation and affordability issues were much larger in their thinking about how they're going to vote than these woke issues. So I find it difficult to pull that apart. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I think you're right. I think there's no deep thinking going on, obviously. Otherwise, woke would not have risen to the state it is. It's a very emotional force. And I think at some point, it's difficult to explain the inflation being the critical factor when the economy in the United States is quite good. I don't think the Democrats took enough credit for the infrastructure program, for instance. Like Biden put in a massive infrastructure program, which will provide jobs and for all kinds of working people well into the future. I mean, I think that was a really important thing. Obviously, inflation is a global phenomenon. It's not a particular phenomenon. No one government is to blame for that, but governments get blamed for that.
As they should be blamed. I blame the governments for that.
Well, collectively, I do too. I mean, I think their response to inflation was entirely wrong. But my feeling, and I don't have any evidence for the position I'm taking. If this is my conversations with Americans, and many of which are my family. I got loads of cousins that I talk to all the time. And they couldn't tell me why they're voting for Trump. They didn't like the direction the Democrats were taking the country in. They didn't like, and they reacted viscerally to the fact that they desecrated the flag. you know, I mean, it got down to that level that
Don't let that happen.
football players kneeling at the wrong time, or Americans have a strong association with the symbols of the republic, and they react very emotionally when those are challenged. So you may be right, but
But I mean, to Yogi's point, I think to reflect on yours as well. We have an article that's being assembled from someone living in California who is absolutely crystal clear that literally every county in the United States that numbered in the thousands saw an increase in Republican votes. Very few were Democratic, as we can see, but it was that that wave that literally, so something was going on that was mass. Now, inflation is certainly one of them. But what he cites living in California, it was people have become absolutely offended of what's happening with homelessness and with the way the immigrants are being gifted as they come into the US and came into California with $250,000 tax credits in order to help them buy a home, and on it went. And people got offended that the state was providing more benefits to those that they saw weren't working as hard or were as deserving as were citizens in the US itself. That can be very painful. And California absolutely blew up over that. The mayors have lost in both Los Angeles and San Francisco. All of the councils are being turned over. So the extremes of this woke agenda that were witnessed in California are coming back to roost. And I think that's what we just saw in the US. Okay, anyone further want to challenge Robert, want to add to the agenda? We've covered a great deal today, Robert. This was exceptional. A lot of history as a foundation, but Yogi, I think you've helped us get grounded in what does this mean to Ma and Pa from Des Moines? Go ahead, Peter.
Robert, a topic that I'm quite involved in, especially in regard to artificial intelligence, is the concept of integrity. And I'm just wondering how integrity fits in any of the arguments that you've been presenting here. I know you haven't used the word, but it's been implied.
Well,
Is it part of it? Is it something that is lacking? If you could elaborate, I appreciate it. Thank you.
well, I think it's a fundamental ingredient of civil society that people acting with integrity, with restraint, preserving the bonds of fealty in a civilization, that if you're a neoliberal, for instance, and society doesn't exist, then you won't value those, and so you'll tend to value individual achievement and individual accomplishment. And so I think
Almost transactional.
yeah, it becomes very, very simplistic, and Milton Friedman famously said that the only social responsibility of business is to make a profit. Well, that's fine, but people translate that into an idea that it's only the individual that matters, that we have no moral responsibility towards one another, and therefore the idea of integrity is an old-fashioned idea that we should really get on with maximizing our personal position, and that's the best of all possible worlds. So integrity has been eroded with civil society, with all of the collective infrastructure that supports individuals, and it's a critical ingredient of, I think, the most important foundational asset of capitalism, because a civil society is the source of law, and law is, you don't have private property rights in the absence of law. So integrity, civil society, those are at the very base of capitalism. That's what it rests upon.
This, by the way, was another point that's been made in California, is unless the theft was a property worth more than $900, there was no charge. You could literally go into a store and steal and be outside, be within the law.
Yeah.
And that was enough. That's what blew up in San Francisco, was these gangs marauding into stores and stealing, knowing full well that they would not be charged.
Right.
Robert, it's this word integrity that I think has a lot of us really worried in Canada, in that, we're now confronting a government that is led by a person who has no integrity or shown no integrity for a long time. And it makes us fearful that we're confronting such irrationality.
Yeah, I think it's affected. It's not just a liberal problem. It affects politics more broadly.
Right.
You can, whatever you can get away with, it seems to be self-justified. And so I think there's certain things we have to relearn, and the importance of integrity. It's vital importance, because it's not just marginally important. It's a critically important element. And leaders have to be especially guarded, because they set the model. And if they lack integrity, then it becomes a generalized condition. And so I agree with you. I think, that's a critical element of recovering from the disease of wokeism.
Well, as we get into wrap up, integrity is one thing. I'd like to just see a return to good manners.
Well,
I'll leave it at that.
Oh, jolly good, jolly good.
If you're viewing this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button for receiving notice of the KEI Network's conversations. We're at the intersection of leadership and emerging technologies, politics and policy. Also consider visiting the KEInetwork.net to access our newsletters and options for helping the network grow and learn, engage and explore. It really helps. Thank you.